All right. So I'm very excited to have Myev Rees on the show, on the Cheeky Scholar. Myev received her PhD in religious studies at Northwestern University, and she's now associate professor of philosophy and religious studies at Cypress College. Myev grew up in Southern California. She loves food, wine, and rescuing dogs. And I can attest to this because whenever I go over, I play with the pups, and you're a chef extraordinaire. Instead of asking you for the best recipe this time around, Myev, I'm going to actually ask you if you could come up with the worst imaginable ice cream flavor, what would it be?
Ooh, worst imaginable ice cream flavor. I think maybe something like smoked salmon, right? Something
Ooh,
that
oh
would be
my
terrible.
God. Yeah, smoked salmon would be really bad. I think anything in the fish or marine animal category would be a pretty bad one. I was thinking sardine and blueberries would be
Yeah.
pretty horrendous, but yeah, yeah. Well, anyway, we can start talking about much less important things now. Um, so Maya, you specialize in religious studies, and I know you've studied fundamentalist groups in the United States specifically. And what I thought was so interesting when I was talking with you ahead of time about your research is you've looked a lot at the Institute of Basic Life Principles. Like this is sort of an organization that you've focused on with your research. The name of the Institute of Basic Life Principles, doesn't sound very interesting, but when I looked them up, I was shocked to find out who they are. So, would you mind telling me what exactly is the IBLP? What's their mission?
Yeah. Yeah. It's one of the most banal names for an extremist organization, right? The Institute of Basic Life Principles sounds like a bad sort of self-help kind of, movement or something like that.
Yeah.
But no, the Basic Life Institute, I'll just call them the IBLP.
Mm.
That is their current name. It started as the Institute in Basic, I believe, Youth Conflicts. This is
Huh.
earlier in the 20th century, founded by a man named Bill Goddard. And it's what we call a parachurch organization. So it's not an
Right.
official denomination. It's an organization of conservative evangelicals that got started to address the, I would call, moral panic of the mid 20th century of juvenile delinquency. Right?
Huh. Okay. And that
The
was in the early 60s, right?
Right, yeah. And so this is like, the rebel without a cause, the James Dean
Mm.
panic, right? What are the
Mhm.
teenagers doing? And so and this came along with the general moral panic around the decline of the traditional nuclear family.
Mhm.
And which, was helped along by the women's movement, by, all kinds of the civil rights movement and so on. So
Right.
what happens is this man, Bill Goddard, begins hosting these seminars. So they're basically just live events that people start coming to, and they start coming by the thousands. They're incredibly popular.
Right.
And then eventually he kind of does this sort of like circuit tour, where he's hosting all of these big seminars. Eventually he starts turning it into a curriculum that people are sort of taking home with them. There are these,
Right.
textbooks that he starts to self-publish.
So
The
it's almost
IBLP.
like a, yeah, and so it's almost like a homeschooling type of situation or kind of like a self-education,
Yes.
type
So it
of setup
starts
here.
out, yeah, it starts out aimed at parents helping build strong Christian families, quote unquote, and parents who are concerned about moral decay, moral decline, and all of these kinds of things. It doesn't
Yeah.
really jump into homeschool curriculum until the 1980s, and
Right.
that's sort of that maps on with the history of American homeschooling generally.
Yeah.
So that's you start to see more and more families deciding, in conservative Christianity, to homeschool, far more now than in the 80s. So there's been a pretty steady increase.
Right.
Um,
Yeah.
but
And you've been to, yeah, you've been to some recent conferences with the IBLP. I know when you were doing your field work and working on your doctorate, my understanding is you went to a couple of the what they're called conferences or meetings for members of the IBLP. Can you tell me a little bit about what that was like and what you saw there?
Yeah, so these homeschool conferences. So now the IBLP is a sort of a comprehensive homeschool curriculum. And I say
Mhm.
comprehensive in the sense that it's comprehensive for them.
Mm.
It is severely lacking in sort of basic math, history, things that we would consider to be important parts of an education program. But
Right.
so now it's a whole sort of system, but it doesn't just stop at homeschooling. It really is about how marriages should function, how many
Mm.
children people should have. So one of the hallmarks of the IBLP is that Bill Goddard taught that parents should, or husbands and wives should welcome as many children as God will give them. So they don't practice any kind of birth control, including the rhythm method or natural family planning or anything like that. It's
Hmm.
complete openness, regardless of what that means for the health of the mother and so on, or
Right.
the financial, freedom of the family and so on. So it's not just homeschooling; it's how husbands and wives relate to each other. It's how parents are supposed to relate to children.
Sure.
It is a lot, real stress on child discipline. They're advocates of corporal punishment for children as young as infancy.
Hmm.
So it's a pretty all-encompassing world.
Right.
So the vast majority of folks who engage with the IBLP engage with it through the homeschooling curriculum, through the family structure curriculum.
Right.
But they do have these live gatherings, and that they call
Right.
homeschool conferences.
Got it.
And
And they're very family oriented, right? Like you go
they
there
are
and there's
they are
lots of
aimed
big
at the
families.
family. So
Okay.
they happen at various places around the country. The biggest one is their annual one, which happens in Big Sandy, Texas. They have a campus in Big Sandy, Texas.
I
They're
couldn't
one
make
of
up
the
a name like that if I tried. Big Sandy, Texas. It's like so
It's
perfect.
very Texas name. Yeah, it's a very Texas name. About 3 hours east of Dallas. Just to give you a sense, it's in a little teeny
Okay.
town. If you blink, you'll drive past it.
Okay.
So it's yeah, I think that it's closest, if memory serves, to Tyler, Texas. That's where I remember going to get barbecue
Mm.
when I was there. But so the IBLP has now, because it has become this whole organization, it has lots of little parts. And one of the parts is called the Alert Academy. The Alert Academy is a sort of paramilitary organization for young men. So
Mm.
think of it sort of like a Boy Scout program meets boot camp, right? So
Wow.
it's at kids who are as young as 6 or 7 years old, but goes all the way up to high school, and all the way up into the early 20s. And at that level, it's very much a sort of paramilitary organization. They have
Got it.
uniforms, they drill, they do all of the things. They have ranks, and unlike the Boy Scouts, right?
Right.
And all of that. So the Alert Academy campus is in Big Sandy, Texas. And so it's sort of the place where the IBLP is now headquartered. It used to be actually headquartered in Illinois, but now they've moved it entirely to the Alert Academy campus in Big Sandy.
Got it.
So
Okay, so the men are there. They're doing these paramilitary things, and boys as well. They've got these rankings. Are women there doing anything at all? Do they have
not
activities?
on the yeah, not on the regular, but for this once a year event, they host these what they call the family conferences. And that's when IBLP families from all around the country descend into Big Sandy, Texas, and they camp essentially. They come in
Oh
giant
wow.
RVs, they come in multiple minivans, because we're talking about families of 10, 12, 13, 14 children, right? So I mean, they're not all
Wow.
that big, but a lot of them are that big.
But they're pretty
um,
massive. These are massive
yeah, those are
families.
big
Yeah.
families. I mean, I think that it was very unusual unless it was a very young family, it
Hmm.
was unusual to see a family of two kids, right? Usually you'd had
Right.
multiple siblings. And so it's a vacation, and it's the sort of primary vacation for a lot of these folks. They pack up their stuff and all the things that 13 kids could possibly need. They've got little bikes, and they've got the diapers, and they've got the stuff, and they all
Wow.
caravan to Big Sandy, Texas, where everybody sort of gathers together, and they line it all up. And I mean, it's sort of like it's like kid chaos. There's
Yeah.
gaggles of little kids running around everywhere, and all kinds of things. And what they
Yeah. I
have
mean, my
there,
gosh, even parents of one or two small children will tell you that they're almost like chaos machines.
Yeah,
You
yeah.
know,
So,
it's a lot like
imagine,
that. As lovable and wonderful as they are, they're also like these kind of
right.
chaos machines. Yeah.
Yeah.
So you went to one of these conferences, and you went,
I
I'm
went to a
guessing, just
few
as
of
a
them.
single woman, or you went by yourself.
Yeah, they are technically open to the public. They're not, you don't
Okay.
have to, you have to buy a ticket. And
Mm-hmm.
but there were no, you give them your name and you register just like anything else. So I can't imagine why anybody who's not associated with the IBLP would want to go, unless
Mm.
they were a researcher or a reporter, maybe. But it's a bit of an insular group, and so they really flew under the radar of the popular press
Mm-hmm.
until very, very recently. And even then, we're still very much an understudied group, particularly
Right.
given their political influence, which I can get into in a minute. But the big,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah, the big
But let's
conference,
talk about what you saw there. What did
yeah,
you, was there any particular experiences that you had there that really just kind of struck you or have kind of stayed with you?
there are a couple of experiences that were hard. So the gathering is organized. There's like a giant sort of auditorium where everybody can gather for like opening ceremonies and keynote speakers and things like that. There's a book sale area, just like any other conference, right? There's like an area where you're selling these, but nothing that would be available in mainstream shelves, very niche things in fundamentalist evangelical materials.
Mm,
And then there are all these sort of breakout schedule groups for young married couples, little seminars for mothers, seminars for men, and so on. So I tried to go to as much as I could go to without having to be in two places at once. And I was obviously not welcome in the men's groups, so I didn't try to attend those. But I did attend some of the married couples one. I did ask permission to sit in on that, even though I was single, and some other ones for mothers. And I think that, I mean, there's a couple of things that really strike you. If you're familiar at all, probably what listeners might be most familiar with the IBLP is through the Duggar family, which is the TLC's 19 Kids and Counting reality show.
right.
Started
Yeah, I
as
remember
14.
hearing that name. I remember hearing that
Yeah,
name when I was younger.
right. So yeah, they start out as this like reality show family, and then they eventually sort of become this huge sort of thing. And then there's a very public fall from grace where their son is convicted of having child pornography. He molested his sisters and a family friend,
Oh my
and
gosh.
is now incarcerated.
Yeah.
And so that caused TLC to drop the show. But of course, the Duggars are a huge money making thing, so they sort of quickly created a new show for just the daughters. And so anyway,
Hmm.
so I think that what people would notice right away if they were to go, is that it's like being in a community of people, but there's thousands of people who are just like the Duggars. So they dress very modestly in long dresses. All of the women have very long hair. It's a teaching of Bill Goddard, for women to have long hair as their
Hmm.
crowning glory. It's predominantly white, which
Hmm.
makes sense when you start to look at the homeschooling curriculum, which has a very white supremacist bend
Right, and
to
we'll
it.
get to that in a little bit too, because I know that's been an important part of your work and like even the
Yeah.
book that you've been working on in the early stages. So we'll get to that in a bit. Yeah.
Yeah. And so what you notice on the surface is, thousands of really seemingly very happy families, right? Sort of all going about doing this like fun camping vacation kind of thing, right?
Yeah.
Um, and but when you start to hear some of the stories, you start to see some of the cracks. So
Mm.
one of the things that the IBLP teaches, and Bill Goddard really has emphasized throughout his career, is what he calls the umbrellas of authority. So that women fall under the umbrella of authority of their husbands, when they are married, when they are unmarried,
Right.
it's their fathers. And then the husbands fall under the umbrella of authority of the of church organizations, church leaders, government leaders, and so on, right? And so it's a
Hmm.
very structured hierarchical thing. And so the women in these communities are expected to accept their husband's leadership, and to not argue. And sometimes these husbands make questionable financial decisions, right? And it's
Mm.
also very difficult to have 14 children in
Right. I
any
can imagine that
economy.
puts so much strain
Huge
on just
amount
the
of
parents'
financial.
resources. Yeah. Yeah.
Exactly. And another complicating teaching of Goddard's is that they do not allow for any kind of debt, which includes credit card debt, but also mortgages and
Mhm.
car loans and things that we would sometimes use to build wealth in this,
Right.
in our economy. Now, not everybody in the IBLP hones exactly to all of these laws all of the time, but the vast majority of them do. And
Hmm.
so you have a lot of these families who are really financially struggling.
Hmm.
But there is this almost unsettling veneer of cheerfulness, which
Hmm.
many viewers caught on when they were watching 19 Kids and Counting, right? Many
With the
people
Duggar
remarked,
family, right?
yes,
Yeah.
exactly. Many people remarked at how this woman with 19 children never seemed to raise her voice. And she always spoke in this infantilized, sweet, high pitched sort of way, right? And
Yeah.
it's that is that kind of behavior for women is something that we say is caught and it's taught. So it's
Hmm.
something that is expressly taught to be submissive, to be sweet, to be to not be challenging, to be a helpmeet, which is one of their favorite words,
Yeah.
to your husband. But it's also caught because it's the way that the culture speaks, right? It's the
Right.
expectation that people have for women and so the children that are raised in this movement grow up hearing their mothers speak like that and so on. So a
Right.
lot of these women are living in situations that are really challenging. I
Mhm.
one woman shared in a mother's group about how based on some decisions that her husband had made, they were struggling to pay the heating bill.
Mhm.
And it was winter time, and she was telling the story that if you had seen it written down and read it, you would have thought that this was a deeply tragic story about how her children were cold and they had
Mm.
to all sleep together, all 10 of them sleep together in the living room. And as she put it, piled up like puppies. And she's to
Wow.
keep warm. And she was describing this as if it was a blessing, as if
Mhm.
this was a moment that God had provided to strengthen her faith, right? And that's the sort of the sort of the loop that runs through the way that women speak in these communities, so that everything that is challenging becomes an opportunity to test your faith, right? Everything
Mhm.
that's difficult becomes an opportunity for you to witness for Christ. And so what that does is that it nips in the bud any kind of disagreement, any kind of dissent, any kind of demand, perhaps from the
Right.
part of the wife that maybe she doesn't want to have kid number 11 since they can't keep the 10 they have warm in the winter.
Right,
And
right. And
there,
how
this
old do
is
you
not,
think that mother was? How old do you think that mother was that you saw
she was
telling the
probably in
story?
her early 40s. Yeah, she was
Okay,
probably in her
okay.
early 40s. Yeah.
Right. So she had time at
Um,
that point to have quite a few children, and this was the
yes.
situation they were in. I mean, they were basically living in poverty and they
Yeah.
couldn't keep the kids warm, but she did not see that. As you're explaining, it's like she didn't see that as a problem, or at least on the surface, it's like the way she's relating the story was like, we are so blessed to be
And
living in this situation.
that's the sort of striking thing that you get is that I don't think that these stories would be told if there wasn't some part of her that was hurt, upset, afraid in that moment.
Hmm.
She would be sharing that, but it's very quickly turned around into this socially acceptable way that you can make sense of it, which is to then continue to be a witness for this lifestyle. Another thing that's sometimes hard in as an educated woman who makes her living now as a college professor, the education, the value of education is undervalued deeply in this community. There's a real
Hmm.
contempt for higher education in particular,
Right.
and especially for girls. So it was challenging to sit in a room and listen to women in their 30s and 40s instruct young women who were 15, 16, that their primary objective should be wifehood and motherhood, and that anything that would distract them from that was of what they call the enemy, which is the devil or Satan. And
Right.
so the goal is to, to support your husband, and to even if you don't have one yet, that one of the major teachings that they say over and over again is that every young girl should start praying for her husband as young as possible.
Right.
11, 12 years old, start praying for your future husband, like not
Right.
praying that he'll show up, praying for him, as if I
Wow.
hope he's doing well out there in the world, right?
That's
uh,
incredible. So it's also like a very kind of, there's a lot of aspiration in all of this, right? It sounds like young girls are taught to really aspire to something that maybe doesn't exist yet or something like that. And I know, like, it's interesting you're talking about women and talking about mothers, because my understanding is like your focus on mothers and also like even reproductive rights was a big reason that you went to these conferences. Is that right? Like, why did you go to this conference in the first place?
Well, I went to the conferences because the vast majority of my research, I was interested in the way that this community was presenting on television through the Duggars,
Hmm.
and the way that that television show worked to mainstream some of these values. Because the way that the show really presents the Duggar family, it's as if they're not part of a larger movement, as if they're sort of a one-off, and
Mm.
it's a very apologetic show, right? It's a show that really casts them in a very positive light, and highlights some of the very extreme parts of Goddard's institutions, like the courtship rituals, right, where there is no, hand holding until you're engaged, there is no kissing until you are married. It's a very hyper supervised by the father courtship
Hmm.
process. The way that the show presented that, it was almost like a fairy tale, right? They presented
Mm.
these weddings, and millions of people tuned in to watch these Duggar girls get married, in these very sort of performative of purity culture, what we call purity culture in evangelical circles.
Right.
The IBLPs takes purity culture to a whole new place. So
Right.
even those who espouse purity culture sometimes, don't wait till their wedding day to have their first kiss. But that's, there's a spectrum.
Right. And we
Um,
could get into this in a minute, but it's just kind of interesting that you mentioned this reality show about the Duggars was sort of like a bit apologetic and is like making it look like this is a one off, but it's actually, it seems like it's kind of playing into like, I don't know. I don't know if it's like an increasing amount of Americans are really pushing for much more conservative values, because it wasn't there even like some recent reality shows about like arranged marriages, like these Indian weddings, or like these like kind of women who are specifically employed by like Indian families to like arrange a marriage and find a match for their daughter or for their son. And this was getting like really popular. And even you could argue like The Bachelor or The Bachelorette, there's like kind of a formalized sort of ceremony in that. I don't want to stretch it too far, but it's just interesting to me that like there's kind of this trend even in just reality TV where you see like are American audiences kind of like attracted to these ideas on some level or another, you know?
well, it's funny because, reality television, and this kind of reality television is a big genre, so I'm excluding anything that's like a competition show,
Sure, yeah.
but reality television really gets a lot of its start through this kind of like extreme family. I'm
Mm,
thinking of, TLC's earliest shows like A Baby Story and A Marriage Story, right? That really emphasize this very heteronormative, very procreative, type of relationship that reinforces the idea that a woman's highest calling is in wifehood and in motherhood, right? I mean, and this
mhm,
is, I think that I think you're right to point out that there has been a mainstreaming of that idea, that didn't necessarily, it's not that that didn't exist, it's that has always existed, but that the folks on the fringe have sort of been brought into the mainstream in a way that's very powerful, right?
right.
And you now have, that, gosh, I'm forgetting his name now, but that was he a football player who gave that graduation speech, who said, when his wife's life really began when she got married and had a child, and he's saying this at a college graduation to a room at least 50% of female graduates, right? So this is, and that is the message, right? That's the message of those reality shows. That's the message, certainly, of the IBLP, that is when that is when your life really begins. And
Yeah.
that's when fulfill your calling.
Right, right. And is this so? Do you think then? And we were talking about kind of reality TV, we are talking about the messages of these different types of shows and these narratives. Do you think that what what the IBLP was doing on a larger level is reflective of Christianity on the larger level in the US? Because like it's funny, like here I am podcasting from Los Angeles, of course, and I'm looking around and I'm like, I don't see my neighbors being directly impacted by these views as far as I can tell. I don't think that the state of California is going to like, ban abortion at any point, even though federally we've already seen the overturning of Roe v. Wade. But like, is there something that I'm missing? Like, is there some kind of like a secret Bible belt or something like that that is operating in LA or in Southern California that I'm not seeing? Like, what's going on here?
Um, I yes, except it's not secret. There's there's nothing secret about it.
Lara's just in a cave, and it is not a
No,
secret.
you're not in a cave. You're not in a cave. But I do think that perhaps
Sometimes I do feel like I'm in a cave girl. Also, I don't know.
well, I think that it is indicative of the fact that, you know, given social media, and I am by no means an expert on how algorithms work,
Mm,
but the way that those kinds of systems can create echo chambers where we are surrounded by people like us who agree with us.
mm,
And then we suddenly don't see a lot of, the stuff that's going on are all around us, right? That their neighbors are deeply engaged in some of these ideas. Now, of course, the regional differences do matter. California does tend to be a little bit more left leaning. That said, a great deal of research. I'm thinking of Darren Dochek's book in particular, from Bible Belt to Sun Belt. You know, Southern California has been a hotbed of evangelical culture for a very long time, since the early part of the 20th century, and part of an intellectual evangelical culture too, with the rise of organizations like Fuller Theological Seminary, Pepperdine, the Seventh Day Adventist communities are located here.
hmm.
There's a great deal of conservative Protestantism, and not to mention, Los Angeles is a huge Latino population, and so that is a huge
Right,
Catholic population as well.
right. Yeah,
So the idea that Southern California is somehow secular that is just not the case.
right.
But I do think though that sometimes, and something this is I'm always telling my students, is that sometimes there's a line from Marshall McLuhan, that sometimes gets mistakenly attributed to David Foster Wallace, which is that the only thing that the fish don't see is the water. The
Mm,
idea is that when we are swimming in ideas that are so powerful and so prevalent, they cease to be legible to us, right?
yeah.
That we actually can't see them anymore because they are the water in which we swim. They are the air that we are breathing. And I think that with Protestantism as a concept writ large, it suffuses American culture in a way that sometimes becomes difficult for us to locate and pinpoint, but it is certainly there. Um,
What's an example of that that really like sticks out to you as like that sort of these heavily Protestant, perhaps even evangelical ideas that are kind of part of this water that we swim in? Like what's a great example of that?
Um, well, I think that one of the biggest examples might be something like, when I ask them like, what's the most important question if you want to know something about somebody religiously, the first question they say, oh, well, you ask them if they believe in God, right?
Hmm.
And I'm like, well, sure, that's a reasonable question to ask. But the idea that religion is something that happens in belief, that religion is an individual intellectual activity, right?
Hmm.
That's or what William James said, what a man does in his solitude, right? That idea of religion is something that I intellectually assent to. I choose to believe this, and so therefore I am part of this religious community.
Almost
That
it almost sounds like Rene Descartes, that, Enlightenment era
exactly
philosopher, like I think, therefore I am. And it's almost like I
right.
believe in God and therefore I'm a Christian. That's
Right.
incredible.
And that's great because it works for Protestantism, right? For Protestantism, whether or not you believe in Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior is the central question. That is the biggest thing. You can't walk into a church and say, gosh, I really like the music and I really like the sermon, but I can't get behind this divinity of Christ thing. Is that a problem? Right? I mean, you'd be laughed out of the room, right? Like, no, you have to
I'm sure
believe that.
I'm sure a couple of folks have tried. You never know. You
Yeah.
never
Oh,
know.
yeah. Well, sure. Um, but the primacy of belief, right, is a Protestant idea, right? Because nobody asks that of Buddhists. Nobody asks that of Hindu practitioners. Nobody is, I mean, I have a joke that my rabbi used to say, what do you call the atheist who shows up at Yom Kippur services? You call them a Jew. And because it's, because it doesn't matter. Oh, like, or the sort of the joke of in Judaism, it's like we're fine with one God or fewer, right?
Right,
Just
right.
right.
I used to have one student who used to joke around. We're the only, because she was Jewish, and she's like the only group of people. We're the only group of people who by religion are literally called Jewish. Like it's literally something ish, and that was the joke. And I was like,
yeah, very
I'm
funny.
not Jewish myself, but it's just like kind of hilarious to hear people
Well,
talk
so
about their own beliefs
many,
that way.
yeah, so many religious traditions are much more about practice. They're much
Mm,
more about, or they're about community, right?
mm,
Nobody knocks on your door and says, hello, have you considered becoming a Navajo today? Right? Because being part of Navajo tradition,
yeah.
and there are many Navajos who are Christians of very many, or Diné people who are part of, Christian traditions as well. But the idea that religion is who you are as a community or religion is what you do. This idea that religion is inherently something that happens between your ears, that happens in belief and belief only,
Right.
that's a sign of Protestant hegemony, right? That's a sign that
Mm.
Protestantism has gotten to define the terms of what counts as religion and what doesn't count as religion.
That's
Um,
fascinating. And it's kind of interesting because now that you're saying that out loud, I'm like, oh, so there's a lot of like different beliefs that, let's say, not just Protestants, but specifically evangelicals really adhere to. And one of those key beliefs that we've been hearing about very much recently is the belief that abortion is anti-life, like that you need to be pro-life in order to be even like a good Christian, right? Like there's that attachment to beliefs. So I'm kind of curious, like was something like this belief about abortion being anti-life, or about the importance of being pro-life, has that always been an issue for Christians more widely? Has it always been an issue for evangelicals? Like where did all of this begin?
Yeah, I mean, the answer is no. It hasn't always been an issue for Christianity writ large.
Mm,
Sorry, excuse me. It has not always been an issue for Christianity. Jesus said almost nothing about, actually, Jesus said nothing about abortion. He did say a lot about a lot of other things that conservative Christians don't like to talk about. He said a lot about
mm,
divorce. He said a lot about money. He said a lot about poverty. He said a lot about a lot of things. He didn't mention abortion. And
yeah.
no, abortion has not been has not been a central tenet of Christianity for the beginning of its history. It has become a central tenet of conservative Christianity, conservative evangelicalism in America. And that has happened really in the last 55 years.
Mm,
So the idea that, that in order to be a good Christian, you have to oppose legal and safe access to abortion, or in order to be a good Christian, you have to hold to the idea of fetal personhood, for example. That is
mhm.
a completely modern invention, and not only is it a modern invention, in some ways, it's a very I mean, the Catholic Church does put that forward, but it is also a very American idea.
Hmm.
And so, yeah. So, I mean, basically, I can go into the history of how this happened if you're interested.
I mean, could you tell us briefly, because you said it specifically tends to be very American, like, and very, very briefly, like, how did this all begin? Like, and why is it such an American preoccupation?
Yeah. Well, okay. So in the beginning of the 20th century, evangelical Christians had a kind of crisis. They were being faced with a couple of challenges to their certain types of biblical interpretation. One of those challenges came from the intellectual, from sort of the top down, from the ivory tower, new ways of reading the Bible that we call biblical criticism. Another challenge came from Darwinian theory, right? So from Darwinian evolution, which challenged a literal reading of Genesis. And
Hmm.
so what happened in the United States is that now, of course, there have been evangelicals who were very politically progressive. Some of our most effective urban renewal programs of the 19th century were championed by evangelicals. The women's suffrage, the temperance
Wow.
movement, were all championed by evangelicals. And they
It's
were, I
almost
mean,
like a yeah, it's almost like another face altogether of an evangelical movements that most people do not know about. Like I didn't know they were involved in the suffragette movements. That's insane. you know.
they weren't just involved, they were instrumental. Without them, it would have been delayed decades. So
Mm.
absolutely. So what happens basically in the 20th century is that in the early part of the 20th century is that evangelicals, particularly Southern white evangelicals, begin to feel attacked by elites. This happens largely in response to a very famous court case, the Scopes trial, sometimes called the Scopes monkey trial. It was made famous by the play Inherit the Wind, the Arthur
Oh, it was
Miller play.
named after my podcast, obviously, because I've got like a big monkey on the.
Right, there
Anyway,
you go.
yeah, that's
Yeah,
how
yeah,
important it is.
yeah,
No, and
yeah.
so this
So
is this in the, you said this is in the 1950s?
no, in the 1920s. So
1920s. So this is a little
yeah.
earlier on.
Yeah. So after the Scopes trial, basically what happens is the Scopes trial was a putting on. It wasn't just a matter of whether or not John T. Scopes taught evolution in his public school classroom, which he did, and he did it intentionally, and that broke the law in Tennessee.
Mm.
Tennessee had made that illegal. You could not teach evolution in a public school classroom, and so he broke that law intentionally. And two of the most celebrated celebrity lawyers descended on this little town in Dayton, Tennessee, Clarence Darrow and William Jennings Bryan. And they duked out like the trial of the century. And in some ways,
Wow.
when I teach it to my students, I'm like, imagine like the OJ trial. That's sort of what we're talking about here. It just
Wow.
like the OJ trial wasn't really just about whether or not this man killed his wife, right? It was also about race in America. It was also about the role of celebrity in the justice system. It was about all
Hmm.
those other things. And there were cameras and there was the court of public opinion, right? All of that is
Hmm.
happening in the Scopes trial as well. The
Right.
end result of which is the question is really whether or not evangelical fundamentalism, which was a sort of a new idea that the Bible was absolutely literally true in every single word, and that it could be understood plainly by anybody on the street, right?
Hmm.
So this is what we call a fundamentalist principle, and the fundamentalism gets its name from a series of pamphlets that were put out by two sort of robber baron brothers who had a lot of money, and they put out these pamphlets that listed the fundamentals of the Christian faith as they
Got
understood it.
it. And that was
Um,
also around that time in the
yeah,
1920s.
1920.
Okay.
And
Yeah.
so what fundamentalism does is it's a response to this new definition of modernity that's sort of dawning in America, right? This modernity of progress and science and northern elite institutions and all of these
Right.
kinds of things, right? And fundamentalism sort of emerges as a reaction to that, as a sort of like digging in of the heels and a hardening of ideas that are opposed to all of that. So
That's
fundamental,
fascinating because, and this is just like me kind of coming from my own background too, because you focus on the US. I used to focus on modern Egypt in my own field work. And actually the Muslim Brotherhood was one of like the oldest fundamentalist Islamic groups to ever emerge in Egypt, and they arose in the 1920s as well. And it was in
yeah,
response to this idea of like what it means to be modern and what is modernity and what is a modern culture. And you kind of mentioned things like, science and progress, the idea of the individual and having like
right.
individual aspirations and goals and your own like kind of this existence in the world that's not just attached to God or a higher being. So this is really interesting. This is almost like a global phenomenon, right? Like this sort
Yeah,
of fundamentalist response to modernity.
Yeah, that's right. And sometimes in our contemporary news movement, we when we hear the word fundamentalist, we do tend to think of extremist, violent, terrorist Islam, right? That
Mm,
seems to be what people associate with that word now. But actually, it's an American word. We we created it,
mm,
and it's a word that originated in evangelical Protestantism with the fundamentals, these pamphlets. So what happens is that there's this little subgroup of American evangelicals located mostly in the American South, that are defining themselves as fundamentalists. But the Scopes trial was an incredibly humiliating experience for them. And
mm.
because you have the radio waves that are broadcasting this trial, William Jennings Bryan, who is the champion for the fundamentalist message, is made to look like a buffoon. And then he unfortunately dies like right after the trial ends. So it's almost like it killed him, right?
Wow.
H.L. Mencken, who's one of the great satirists of American history, just goes to town on these people in a very cruel and in many ways unfair way, really
Right.
painting them as these buffoonish, backward Southern, hicks, essentially,
Yeah,
right?
and that
Who have no
stereotype of
faith.
like, yeah, and that stereotype of the Southern hick or even the quote unquote the redneck is still something very alive and well. I notice it when I was like living in Boston, I would see people just like make totally blatant statements about like all Southerners as being like this. So it's something that
Yeah.
very much still lives with us today. We're dealing with the legacy of that.
Yeah, and what that does is that it continues to feed a kind of populism, right, that defines itself against northern elitist, education institutions and so on. So
Mm,
what happens after the Scopes trial is that this is a very oversimplified version, but many evangelicals essentially sort of throw their hands up and say, you know what? We're out. We're going to form our own subculture. We're going to form our own schools. We're going to form our own communities, and to hell with the rest of the country. And in
mhm.
many ways, that's what they do. And in many ways, they drop out of the political system.
Right,
Many
because
of them stop.
they lost this trial to try to say the Bible should be interpreted literally. It doesn't go through, it doesn't work out. They're like, we're out of here. And so then they
And
go on to do their own thing, right?
yes, and one of the tenets of the fundamentals is the imminent return of Christ. So this adds to the idea of like, why would you bother getting involved in a society that is bound for hell when Jesus could come back any minute? Like, why are you going to
Mm,
campaign for a presidential candidate? Why are you going to try to build a university or an institution? Jesus could come back tomorrow, and the world's going to hell in a handbasket. So we might as well just hunker down and
mhm.
create our strength in our sub community, right? And that's sort of what evangelicals do for the better part of the middle 20th century. And it's
Mhm.
not really until the Goldwater campaign where they start to come out, and not really until the rise of the religious right in the late 1970s and early 1980s that
Right,
they
which
begin.
coincides with like that big start of the culture wars, right? We hear that a lot of the time. Culture war, culture war. It actually started in the 1970s, if I understand
Yes.
correct.
Yeah, it starts in the 1970s and it is a creation of the evangelical right.
Mm,
So what essentially happens is that this community sort of stays very insular. And since we are talking about a lot of people who are also deeply invested in a kind of white supremacist idea, they also are setting up what they call segregation academies, these schools that are exclusively white, that do not admit black students, or that if they do admit black students, they do it in a very limited way and they ban interracial dating and so on and so forth. So, with the rise of the civil rights movement in the late 50s and 60s, and then you get the the Act in 1964, that suddenly clues into some of these white evangelical Southerners that society is changing, and it's changing in this really dramatic way, and their quote unquote Southern way of life is under threat. And
mm,
one of the ways in which the Civil Rights Act gets enforced is actually through the Internal Revenue System. So I'm sort of taking a long story here to basically tell you how did abortion become the issue for
right,
these people, right? Like, why did
right.
abortion become the issue? Because the Bible doesn't say very much about it, and Jesus says absolutely nothing about it, right? And so why are we always talking about abortion? And we start talking about abortion largely in response not to Roe v. Wade, but in response to the racial politics of the late 20th century. So
Huh.
what happens is that schools like Bob Jones University, which was an all-white, exclusively white organization, started in Florida, moved to South Carolina, and Bob Jones University only admits white students for most of its history, and then it twists its arm to admit a few African American students, but only married ones because they don't want interracial dating. And then
Wow.
even when they allowed for, non-married African Americans, the interracial dating policy was so strict that you would be expelled if there was any interracial dating, and so on. So as part of enforcing the Civil Rights Act 1964, the Internal Revenue Service decides to say, look, if you are an institution that segregates based on race, if you are discriminating based on race, we're no longer going to consider you a charitable organization. And so we're not going to give you tax exempt status. And any
Wow.
donations that are made to you are no longer claimable, right? So if I write a check to,
Yep.
the American Nazi Party or something like
Right.
that,
Right.
I
Yeah.
can't claim that as a charitable deduction
Right. Yes.
on my taxes, right? Thank goodness. So this is part of, so this is part of that movement. And when that happens, that's when evangelicals come out of their self-imposed subculture, and they start to
Right.
say, okay, look, now the federal government is starting to come after our all-white Christian schools, and we can't have that. And so that's when they start to actually become involved in politics. What does all of this have to do with abortion? Absolutely nothing. That's
Hmm.
the funny thing, is that is the issue that galvanizes the religious right. And this is not a secret. People like Tim LaHaye and Paul Weyrich and Jerry Falwell will have told people publicly out loud that the religious right starts with the Green v. Colony case, which is the case that makes it so that you can't have these segregation academies anymore, that it
Mm.
has nothing to do with abortion. But what they realize fairly quickly is that abortion has the power to galvanize a certain subset of the evangelical demographic and to galvanize a Catholic demographic as well. And if
Huh.
they can bring those groups together, they can exert some political power that they previously didn't have.
So they
So
attach themselves to a larger kind of Catholic demographic, or maybe a more now at this point in the middle of the 20th century, more socially accepted, or 1970s more socially accepted group of Catholics. If they attach to that, boom, there we've got some power in numbers. We have a one common denominator, one common issue that we
right.
can, we can really like mobilize people on, and that is abortion.
Right. So like in 1973, when Roe passes, right? Roe passes in 1973.
Right. Roe v. Wade. Yeah.
Right. No evangelical organization comes out and condemns it. Doesn't happen.
Hmm.
In fact, the Southern Baptist Convention, which is the largest denomination of conservative evangelicals in America, they reaffirm before Roe in 1971, but also again in 1974, a year after Roe, and again in 1976, that they call upon their members to work for legislation that would keep abortion legal and safe in the cases of rape, incest, the welfare of the mother. They do not want this being a federally adjudicated issue.
That's
So
so interesting. So these Southern Baptists were actually, in a certain way, like fighting to keep women's reproductive rights in certain situations legal.
absolutely, yeah.
Huh.
Yeah. Yeah, in 1971, 1974, 1976, the SBC reaffirms that abortion should be something that is legal, that the federal government should not get involved in, and that it should be accessible to women if they need it for financial, emotional, or medical needs. And this is just, and when you contrast that, right, with the most recent, the Southern Baptist Convention met again this last June, right, June of
Mm.
2024, wherein they affirmed that IVF would be against their teachings because they are now affirming fetal personhood.
Hmm.
So they're saying that fetus, like IVF, so not even fetuses, zygotes, I suppose, right?
Right, right.
Forgive me, I'm not up on the medical terminology. But
I believe zygote is the best way to put it. Yeah.
yeah. So the result of IVF, right, the embryo that is in a test tube in cold storage, right, the result of an IVF procedure, that is a person. Now, according to the SBC, the SBC's
Hmm.
official theological statement is that that is a person. In 1971, that was not the case. The
Hmm.
same organization said women should have access to abortion if they want it.
Right, right.
And so you
So,
said massive shift, right?
so are these so like the Southern Baptist Church and these other types of fundamentalist Christian groups, are they putting pressure because they did pair up with like a subset of Catholics who also opposed abortion in the 1970s and moving forward into the 80s. So are these evangelicals now like putting pressure on Christians to adopt a certain stance towards abortion and women's reproductive rights? Like what is going on in terms of like
Yeah.
what their relationship is with other types of Christian groups and denominations
Yeah.
in the United States?
So what happens with the segregation academies is that they lose, right? They lose the cases that they're trying to keep these universities and colleges all white, right? They lose that.
Right.
And they realize that they're sort of politically, they don't have a platform. And so there's this very famous sort of conference call that happens in Lynchburg, Virginia with Paul Weyrich and Jerry Falwell, where they're trying to figure out, well, okay, if we can't campaign on segregation, if we've lost this battle, what is an issue that we could galvanize the country over? And on in this famous call, someone says, "What about abortion?" And what they realize is that abortion has the ability to crack what used to be called the Catholic bloc. So it used to be that the Democratic Party could count on Catholics for their support unanimously, right?
Yes.
Like
Yeah.
almost,
Yeah.
right? I
Yeah.
mean, when you
You
think
think of
about
John F. Kennedy as like the most famous example, Catholic, Democrat, like that was the
right.
traditional
Yeah.
association. Yeah.
And they were deeply invested in labor unions. They were deeply invested in all of these movements that the Democratic Party really represented and counted on at the ballot box. And so, what these evangelical pastors realized was that if they could make abortion the central issue, they could crack the Catholic vote because that was the only thing that
Mm.
Catholics and conservative Christians could get together on.
Right,
And
right.
if
So in
they
other
could
words, they could stop the Catholics from supporting the Democratic Party wholeheartedly at this point.
Yep, exactly, right. They could siphon off Catholic voters from the Democrats to the Republican side. And this was in part because they didn't like Jimmy Carter. And this is kind of getting into a different kind of, conversation about why they didn't like Jimmy Carter.
Sure.
But he was supposed to be their guy. He was this Southern Baptist Sunday school teacher from
Yeah.
Georgia. Like, he was supposed to be their guy. He came to power on their coattails. And then
Yeah.
it
Wasn't he a
turned out
peanut farmer too?
yes, exactly.
Yeah.
And it turned out though that that Jimmy Carter didn't actually represent the values of white supremacist fundamentalist evangelicals and didn't certainly want them legislated. And so this was a problem. And so now all of a sudden evangelical leaders are looking for a new standard bearer, and they find that standard bearer in Ronald Reagan.
Mm.
And so Ronald Reagan becomes their guy, right? Despite the fact that Ronald Reagan has a very pro-choice reputation at this point,
Right.
right?
And he's from California.
And he's from California, and he's divorced, and he's an actor, right? Like he's not.
Yeah.
That way, Reagan is kind of a Trumpy kind of character because you're just like, wait, this guy, like this is
Mm.
your guy, who
Yeah.
stands and seems to not stand for any of the values that you seem to want to hold on to.
Wow.
But he could open the doors of power. And so that's what, yeah. So abortion becomes a very powerful galvanizing issue that they realize very quickly can get people to the polls, that can get people to write checks, that can get people, and it works out so nicely, right? Because when you think about this, who does this serve? Right? The
I
ultimate
was going
goal
to ask
of
about that who it serves, because you were kind of like, it's interesting because we were talking before about like kind of keeping a white supremacist structure in place. How exactly is abortion related to that issue that seems to be actually like the driving factor for these fundamentalist groups, is actually maintaining white supremacy? How do those things connect?
Well, they connect because they are losing the white supremacy argument in the 1970s, right?
Right.
They glob on to abortion in order to make that their new issue so that they can sort of skyrocket
I
themselves
see.
into power
They're kind of like
instead of,
leapfrogging over that first hurdle and using abortion as a way to rocket themselves over. Yeah.
and those first abortion, those religious right abortion opponents actually start calling themselves the new abolitionists. So it's really interesting, right? That
Wow.
here they are trying to maintain segregation, to maintain white supremacy in institutions that get federal tax exemption, and then claiming the mantle of the abolitionist in the process, right? I mean, it's
Wow.
really, really ironic and brazen in that way,
Right.
right?
Right.
Um,
Right.
but when I say who does it serve, it's that Evan, when you're opposing abortion, you have the ultimate sort of martyr story. You have this presumed completely innocent white fetus, right? That is so vulnerable, that doesn't actually need anything, right? This is not a poor person who needs a job. This is not a poor person who needs healthcare. This is a sort of a perfect disembodied victim martyr
Mm-hmm.
that you
Mm-hmm.
can then glob onto and say, this is what we're fighting for, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that can then propel you into power. And then the people who are opposed to those kinds of things get sort of cast as people who want to kill babies, right? And that's, I mean, what a great political message that is, right?
Mm.
Now you've created the concept of pro-life, right? And
Right.
nobody
Right.
wants to be anti-life. That's
Right.
a, you know,
You
that's
made,
a
so you've
terrible.
made so you have like a couple of myths operating here that you're pointing out, Maya. Is like there's, first of all, there's the myth that the Bible's pro-life, which you've shown is not true that at all, and then also this
I
myth
would say
of
that
like a
The Bible is not anti-abortion. I put it that way.
right, right. It's not
Yeah,
anti-abortion, right? I guess that's a good way of putting it. So the Bible is an anti-abortion, and then the other myth is like the myth of the fetus as a martyr, right? And that this is the kind of cause we fight for. I mean, you even see that in like sorts of narratives that say the government wants to go into war, or certain groups of people want to go into war. What do? They make the myth of the good war and the idea that like
yeah,
people going in are the martyrs, and they're the martyrs for some other kind of much bigger cause, right? So that it's like
yeah,
those myths really mobilize people
yeah,
into like holding fast to certain sets of beliefs.
yeah. And it's particularly the white fetus, right?
Right.
And this plays into racist ideas of replacement theory, that
Hmm.
immigrants are going to come in and outbreed white people, and then white people will be a minority, and God forbid, and then the United States Western civilization collapses, and da 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 da, right? And if we
You
can
can
just
just
get
change the definitions for who gets defined as white down the line. And it wasn't
right,
even like
yeah.
over 100 years ago. I think Irish people weren't even considered white at a certain point. So
No,
it's
no, there's actually
fascinating too.
yeah, there's a lot of good scholarship on that. But no, so basically that you get this new story of if white women would just have more babies, right?
Mm.
And if white women would embrace this kind of patriarchal social structure where their job was to just raise white children and raise white families, we
Hmm.
would then have a kind of, perfect white supremacist utopia, right? Where
Wow.
this particular brand of evangelicalism, and I do want to make it clear that like evangelical is a big term that we really haven't spent a lot of time here defining,
Right.
but
Yeah.
there
What is
are
it, like a brief way of defining that term?
I think the most concise way is it's a subset of Protestantism that puts forward the idea that the Bible is inerrant, and that there is a need to evangelize, right? That's the verb from evangelical, to evangelize,
Hmm.
to spread that message. And so you have, and culturally, evangelicals tend to be what we call low church. So, meaning that their clergy tends not to be, they don't have to have PhDs. They can have, I mean, all the many evangelical clergy do have, advanced degrees.
Hmm.
But they do tend to be anti-liturgical, right? They don't have, I always kind of, the quick way I say to my students is, if you walk into a church and there's a pastor in like vestments and a collar and there's incense and there's smells and bells, as you say, right? You are not in an evangelical church. If you
Right.
walk into a church and there is a pastor in a pair of jeans and there are two giant jumbotron screens and there are cup holders in the pews, then you are in an evangelical church, right? It is a different world, right? And so
Right.
there are cultural definitions, there are racialized definitions, there are theological definitions, and so we have to be sort of careful about who we're talking about here.
Sure.
But when I'm
Yeah.
talking about these particular groups of people, I'm talking about dominantly white evangelical Christians who are biblical literalists and who we would once call fundamentalists, although sometimes they don't like that word anymore.
Right, right. So, okay, this kind of I want to like switch gears a little bit too because I'm so curious, you know so much about this topic and you've done all of this research and all of this field work and all of this thinking and writing about the history of these evangelical movements in the US. I often hear I myself have said it. I hear other scholars joke around that research is me search. It's and it's sort of like a running joke, but I think there might be some truth to it, for me at least. Do you think it was true for you? Like, how did you get so interested in studying these groups and studying these topics? Like, do you have a background as an evangelical? Like, is that something that you grew up with?
Yeah, I mean, I don't. There are a lot of scholars that do. My previous advisor, Randall Balmer, started his life as an evangelical, even up to, scholars. Now, many of them are ex-evangelicals that are scholars. I am not an ex-evangelical. I was never raised as an evangelical. But I grew up in Southern California, and I grew up with a lot of evangelicals around me, and in my extended family. I
Mm-hmm.
grew up with friends that went to evangelical megachurches that took me along with them, and I was interested in that. My own family was very religiously eclectic, sort of, ex Catholics and some New Agey stuff here and there, and things like that.
Yeah.
So it's not me search in that regard, but my interest really is in the intersection of religion and politics and power. I think that I was always really interested in, as a child of the 1980s, and I was paying attention to the Bush years, right? That my whole life was really shaped, as was yours, because we're
Yeah.
roughly the same age, that was really shaped by the rise of the religious right. Like my life coincided with the rise of the religious right. um,
Absolutely,
and,
absolutely.
and
I remember protesting Jerry Falwell when I was in college. Like that was like a household name when I
yeah,
was growing
yeah.
up.
So I
Yeah.
don't think that, I think that growing up in that kind of a political milieu, and then just having an interest in these kinds of questions, really made that happen for me.
Wow. And I've heard some monkey with very funny wire rimmed glasses and a medieval looking hat told me that you're working on a book, and the book deals with some of the myths of evangelical movements. Can you share with me what those myths are and what your book is about very briefly?
Yeah, I mean, the book comes out of the fact that I think that there are so many really incredibly well-researched and dense scholarly examinations of the religious right that are out there right now.
Mm.
And I don't think I need to give the world another one. But
You
so
don't need to
what
give the world another dense, dry book. What
I
is
don't,
this?
well, some of them aren't dry, some of them are great,
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah.
but when I'm sitting there thinking about, what are the questions that I'm seeing all the time in my classroom, right? When my students are getting their minds blown, when they're the ones coming saying, wait, what? In my classroom, what are the issues that are making them go, whoa, I never thought about that before?
Hmm.
And so the book really came out of teaching at that really introductory undergrad level. So what I really wanted to do is to write a book that anybody could pick up, that you did not need a PhD to pick up, that would really concisely indicate these untruths that many
Mm.
people are told about the religious right, about Christian nationalism, about conservative Protestantism in America more generally, and upend those untruths, right?
Mm.
So many of my students, think and are deeply traumatized by the idea that if they are not in favor of making abortion illegal in all cases, that they have no place in Christianity. And
Wow.
I'm not a Christian apologist. I'm not a Christian at all. But I see the pain that that causes in their
Right.
lives.
Right. Right.
And I see them feeling unwelcome in their communities and sort of moralists in their faith tradition. And so part of what I want to do is sort of say, like, okay, firstly, let's just do some basic history, right? The
Hmm.
history of Christianity is 2,000 years old, and the abortion debate is 50 years old. So can you be a Christian and be pro-choice? Absolutely. You're in good company, right?
Hmm.
So just starting with something like that, starting with the idea that the opposition to abortion came out of this noble desire to save babies, when it didn't. It came out of a desire for political power in response to a threat against white supremacy, and that this was the issue that could launch them into political power. I'm not saying that evangelicals today don't believe in fetal personhood. I think that many of them do, but they've been taught to believe in it. It was not
Mm.
ever part of the original tradition in any way, right?
Right.
And so, really, what my book is trying to do is to delineate some very clear lies, untruths, myths about, and some of the claims that come directly from these conservative Christian groups, and sort of say, no, that doesn't match up with the historical record. No, that doesn't match up with, what the scriptures actually say. And no, that doesn't, right? Because
Mm.
sometimes I think that, as we've all been paying attention to in the last 10 years, we seem to have lost the plot on some like basic facts, right? We now live in a world of like alternative facts and alternative
Right.
reality. And
Right.
now
Right.
we can't seem to agree on some really basic, like, 1 + 1 is 2 kind of situations. And I think that
Right.
what I really want to do with this book is to just delineate, this is what the historical record says. This is what the scripture actually says, right? This
Right.
is what
Right.
the history of the tradition has said. Um, and then do with that information what you will.
Right. So just the regular
But
person can kind of like almost not armor, but sort of like equip themselves with that information so that they're not kind of being fed this sort of it almost sounds like some of these fundamentalist groups are almost gaslighting other people and other Christians into being like, well, in order for me to be Christian, I have to believe that the Bible is anti-abortion, and I have to believe, and if I don't hold that belief myself, I'm not a real Christian. I mean, there's just something about that sounds, these untruths are really kind of misleading people, it sounds like.
yes, yeah, and it is misleading, right? And
Yeah.
it's a denial of so much rich history, right? The Christian bedrock of the civil rights movement, right? That so much of this, the rise of the religious right, was responding to. I mean, part of the reason why white Southern evangelicals stayed out of politics was because they saw politics getting involved in causes like equality that they were not in support of. And
Hmm.
so, I mean, when Jerry Falwell, stands up in 1965 and says, I mean, it's crazy to think now, we think Jerry Falwell as the political pastor, right? But in 1965, on the day that Martin Luther King and others marched from Selma to Montgomery, that very day, Jerry Falwell stood up and gave a speech about how evangelical pastors should not be involved in politics ever.
Hmm.
Period. The end. Right?
Wow, what a
1960.
contrast. What
Yeah.
a contrast.
And what we see is that what he really meant was evangelical pastors should not be involved in those politics, in the
Right.
politics of African American empowerment, in the politics of civil rights. We shouldn't be involved in those politics, because then when it became the politics that he agreed with, well, then they came out, right? Then he was all about it.
Wow.
And
Right, right, right.
so
Yeah.
I think that that's this is sort of, it is really interesting, as somebody who studies this history, is that it's remarkable to me how short our memories are, that this isn't
Hmm.
that long ago, right? This is
Right.
our parents' generation, right? We're not
Right.
talking about some long patinaed past, right? This is
No, no.
no.
This is like
And
living people who remember like being almost adults in that era and they're remembering
yeah,
that, which kind of gets me to like, this is like one last question that I wanted to ask you as we wrap up, which is, oftentimes when I hear experts brought on, say, the news or a podcast or whatever to talk about religion, sometimes you get a historian, but more often than not, I've heard people like political scientists, legal experts, sometimes they're lawyers. Why is like what is it about your background and your knowledge in religious history that you think gives you an edge to understand what is going on here and to kind of like address what you were saying, like our memories have gotten so short? Like how does that kind of background in that humanities type discipline give you an edge?
yeah, I mean, I don't know if it gives me an edge, but it gives me a different voice. And I think that we need all the voices we can get, right?
Mm,
I love, reading, the texts that come out of, sociologists who are dealing with data and who are dealing with statistics and things like that. That's not my world. That's not the world I live in. But that's really valuable work. And taking this view from a political scientist perspective is also really valuable work. And taking this view from a historian's perspective is really valuable work. What I like about what religious studies can give you is a very multidisciplinary approach all at once, right?
hmm,
So that it's not just we in religious studies, we don't tend to reduce what we are seeing to the political or the economic or the sociological.
I
We tend to
see.
try to see that in concert with each other, right?
Right.
Um,
And you have a
so
knowledge of the scripture itself too, right? Which is really
there's that as
interesting.
well.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's that as well, because that is sometimes and a history of the tradition, right? Because I mean, you can be an expert in American political life and you can spend your entire career being well steeped in American political life, but you may not know that, what the official stance of Luther was on this, right? Like they may not know the whole history of this within the religious tradition, right?
Sure.
And that's valuable information because it does actually, whether or not people are aware of it informing their view, it does inform their view.
Wow. So do you have a sense then, because I can't wait to read this book that you're writing. Do you have a rough sense of, is it in the nascent stages? Do you have a sense
Fairly
of when it might
nascent
come out? Or
stages.
how can
So
people kind of follow up on how you're doing? Are you on social media?
I am on social media at Myev Rees on Instagram, but I haven't really started the social media campaign for this kind of work yet. So we'll
Okay.
see. We'll see how public I want to be.
It's still an incubator. It's still incubating there.
Build an
So yeah.
incubator, and
Yeah.
I'm also aware of. I'm still trying to figure out how much of a public scholar I would ever want to be.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Some
Yeah.
people are very comfortable in that place, and other people are not. So we'll have to
Yeah.
see where I land.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, time will tell and you'll know what's the best decision for yourself, right?
Yeah,
So,
exactly,
yeah. Yeah.
exactly. Yeah.
Well, Maev, I mean, in the sake of sharing this incredibly, not just valuable information, but great stories with listeners who, maybe they're going to college, maybe they're not, maybe they have a full time job or they're taking care of their kids. Anybody who's interested in this, I think, is going to be thrilled to hear this conversation. I know I really enjoyed it. So I want to
Oh,
thank you again for being on The Cheeky Scholar. I thought this was fantastic, and I just feel like I learned so much and I had a lot of fun.
oh,
So,
good. Good, good, good.
yeah.
Well, thank
Yeah.
you. Thank you. This is fun.